The first time Lucy Archer pulled a fresh loaf of sourdough from her stone oven and set it on the sill to cool, she had no idea that a broad-shouldered cowboy leaning against the hitching post across the street was already reaching into his vest pocket for a coin. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Clover Creek, Texas, sat baked and golden under a sky so wide and blue it made a person feel simultaneously free and terribly small. The town had sprung up along a bend in the Cimarron River 10 years prior, fed by cattle drives pushing north, and by homesteaders who had dared to plant roots in soil that did not always agree to cooperate. There was a general store run by a man named Hector Poole, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that smelled of tobacco and spilled whiskey, a blacksmith shed that rang with iron all morning long, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of homes pressing close to the main road like modest people at a party who were not quite sure they had been invited. Lucy Archer had arrived in Clover Creek 6 months before that spring morning, in the autumn of 1877. She was 24 years old. With chestnut hair she kept braided over one shoulder, green eyes sharp enough to read a man's character before he had finished shaking her hand, and hands already calloused from years of kneading dough. She had come west from Ohio after her father passed and left her nothing but a small sum of money, a cast-iron stove that had taken 3 men and most of a morning to load onto the wagon, and a recipe book written in her mother's looping handwriting, pages stained gold with butter and flour. She had chosen Clover Creek because it had no bakery. She had done her research carefully, writing letters to 3 different towns before she settled on this one, asking practical questions about population and commerce. A town of roughly 300 souls with no bakery was exactly the kind of place where a woman with skill and determination could build something real. She rented the narrow building beside the land office, cleaned it herself, whitewashed the walls, wrestled the cast-iron stove into position with the help of the blacksmith, a quiet older man named Chester who charged her fairly and didn't once suggest she ought to find a husband instead of a business license. She hung a simple sign above the door that read Archer's Bread in plain black letters, because she believed a thing ought to say what it was without pretension. The first week, she sold 12 loaves. The second week, 18. By the end of November, she was selling out before noon most days, and the women of Clover Creek had begun requesting her specifically for Sunday dinners, weddings, and every church potluck. She made sourdough with a crackling crust and a soft, tangy interior. She made cornbread sweet enough to eat plain. She made rye loaves dense and satisfying, perfect for slicing thick and eating alongside beans. She made a honey wheat on Saturdays that people lined up for 30 minutes before her door opened. Lucy rose before the sun every morning, stoked her fire, set her doughs to their final rise, and had the first loaves ready by 7 in the morning. She kept careful notes in a small ledger, which loaves sold fastest, which days brought the most customers, what the weather did to her sourdough starter. She was serious and organized and proud in a way that was entirely earned. She had not come to Clover Creek looking for love. She had come looking for independence, and she had found it, and she was deeply satisfied with that. She was pleasant to her customers, warm even, but she kept a professional distance that most of the townspeople respected. The single men who came in hoping to flirt generally received polite but decisive handling. Lucy Archer was not rude. She was simply not available for that particular conversation. And then David Winslow walked in. It was a Tuesday in early March of 1878, with a cold wind still rattling the windows and a pale, thin sunshine doing its best outside. Lucy had 4 loaves cooling on the sill and 2 more in the oven when the door opened, and the bell she had hung above it gave its small jingle. She looked up from the counter where she was wiping flour from her forearms. He was tall, 6 feet at least, with the kind of lean, rangy build that spoke of years spent on horseback rather than at a table. He had dark brown hair curling slightly at the collar from under a battered hat the color of dried clay, a jaw that could have been cut with a straight edge, and eyes the particular shade of gray that comes just before a rainstorm when the sky goes soft and serious. He was wearing a canvas trail coat dusty from the road, boots worn smooth at the toe, and a belt buckle shaped like a longhorn that had clearly seen better days. He looked like a man who had been many places and slept under many skies, and he carried it all without the swagger some men used to cover up the fact that they had done nothing interesting at all. He stepped inside and looked around the small bakery with an expression Lucy could not immediately read. Not the casual gaze of a man browsing, something more careful than that, something that looked almost like relief. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even with the measured quality of a man who chose words the way some men chose horses, deliberately and with an eye toward the long road. "Good morning," Lucy said, replacing her cloth on the counter. "What can I get for you?" He looked at the loaves cooling on the sill. He looked at the small chalkboard where she listed her prices. Then he said, "I'll take all 4 of those." Lucy blinked. "All 4? "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. He did not look like a man hosting a dinner party. He looked like a man who had slept outdoors recently. "That's $2 for the lot," she said. He reached into his vest without hesitation and placed 2 silver dollars on the counter, clean and exact. She wrapped the loaves in cloth she kept folded on the shelf behind her, tied each bundle with a length of twine, and stacked them on the counter. He tucked them under his arm with practiced ease. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," Lucy said, and he walked out. She stood in the quiet of her bakery for a moment, listening to the door settle back into its frame. 2 more loaves in the oven. She would pull them in 15 minutes. She did not think about David Winslow again until the following Tuesday, when the bell above her door jingled at 7:10 in the morning, and there he was again, in the same coat and hat, with the same unhurried expression. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, already reaching for the cloth. "I'll take whatever you have ready." She had 6 loaves that morning, 2 sourdough and 4 cornbread. He bought every one of them, laid the exact money on the counter, thanked her and left. She watched him through the small window as he walked to his horse, a big buckskin gelding tied at the post outside, and secured the loaves in his saddlebags with the same careful deliberateness he seemed to apply to everything. Then he rode north out of town. By the 3rd Tuesday, Lucy was watching for him. Not consciously, not in the way she might have admitted out loud, but when she heard the bell above the door that morning she already knew, before she looked up, who it would be. He bought 6 loaves again. He paid without any discussion of price, as though the money were entirely secondary. He said good morning and thank you and left. His boots made a particular sound on her wooden floor, a slow and even rhythm that she found herself listening for. By the 4th week she had begun baking an extra 4 loaves on Tuesdays, telling herself it was simply good business to be prepared. She used her best sourdough starter, the one she had been feeding since Ohio, the one her mother had begun before her. She baked them with particular care, watching the color of the crust through the iron door of the oven and pulling them at precisely the right moment. He came every Tuesday without exception, through all of March and into April. He never missed a week. He always arrived between 7 and 7:30 in the morning. He always bought every loaf she had ready, no matter how many that was. 2, 4, 6, 8. Once she had 8 loaves cooling and he bought them all without blinking. That morning he had laid 4 silver dollars on her counter and she had counted them twice after he left, not because she thought he had made an error but because she was flustered and needed something to do with her hands. The townspeople noticed. Of course they did. Clover Creek was a small place, and small places have long memories and longer tongues. The women who came into her bakery in the afternoons mentioned it with the particular delicacy of people who are not being subtle at all. "That cowboy comes every Tuesday," observed Mrs. Clara Finch, the wife of the land agent, one afternoon in April while choosing between rye and sourdough. "David Winslow, his name is. Works a ranch up north, the old Hargrove property. Bought it 2 years back after it went bankrupt. He's been fixing it up, I hear. He buys bread," Lucy said simply, wrapping Clara's loaf. He buys all of it, Clara said, with the weight of a woman making a point. He has an appetite, Lucy said. Clara smiled in the knowing way of older women and did not press the point any further, which somehow made Lucy more unsettled than if she had said something direct. She began to wonder, genuinely, who he was feeding. The thought had occurred to her before, but she had pushed it aside as none of her business. A man could buy bread for any number of reasons. He might have ranch hands. He might have family. He might simply like bread and have poor domestic skills, which was, in her experience, not an uncommon condition among men who lived alone. But 8 loaves was a great many loaves. The Tuesday in early May arrived with a morning so clear and warm that Lucy had propped open her door before dawn to let in the clean air. She had baked 6 loaves, taking slightly more time than usual on the scoring of the crust, making the diagonal cuts a little more careful, the pattern a little cleaner. She did not examine this impulse too carefully. He arrived at 7:15. The door was already open, so there was no bell, just the sound of his boots on the threshold and then on her floor. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Winslow," she said. Something shifted in his expression when she used his name. Not quite surprise, more like the recognition that something had been acknowledged. "You know my name," he said. "This is a small town," she said. "You know mine, I suspect." "Miss Archer," he said, and the way he said it was entirely even and polite, but there was something in the quality of it that landed in her chest in an unexpected way. "I'll take what you have," he said, and she was already wrapping the first loaf. She had 6 ready. He paid $3 and tucked the loaves under his arm. He turned to go, and Lucy, who was a practical woman and a direct one, said the thing she had been keeping behind her teeth for weeks. "Mr. Winslow," he turned. She met his eyes, which in the clear May morning light were not quite the gray she had thought but had a faint color in them like stone near water. She asked the question plainly. "How many people are you feeding?" The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He seemed to actually consider the question as though it deserved a real answer, which it did. "Just myself," he said. She stared at him. "You buy 8 loaves of bread a week for yourself." "Most weeks," he agreed. He seemed to be measuring something, the way a man does when he is deciding how much of the truth to offer. "That is," Lucy said carefully, "a very large quantity of bread for one person." "It is," he allowed. "And do you eat it all?" A pause. And then, almost quietly, something that was not quite a smile but was the ghost of one. "No, ma'am, I give most of it away." She leaned her hip against the counter. "To who?" He held her gaze steadily. "The McCready family west of my property. 4 kids and their grandmother. Their father passed last winter and they don't always have enough. And the Salazar brothers, they're working my fence line this month and they're good men. And old Pete, the man who lives in the dugout past the creek. He's got a bad leg that keeps him from coming to town." Lucy said nothing for a moment. She was processing this information with the same deliberateness she applied to everything. "You could have told me that," she said. "I didn't figure it was relevant to the transaction," he said. She looked at him with the full attention she gave things that interested her, which was not everything and not everyone. "You ride all the way from your ranch every Tuesday to buy bread for your neighbors." "It's not so far," he said. 12 miles. 12 miles is not nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the bright morning air coming through the open door, and there was something in his expression that was honest in a way that disarmed her, because she was good at reading people, and what she read in him was something that did not perform, did not posture, did not have any of the slick self-congratulation she might have expected from a man telling a story that made himself look good. "Your bread is good," he said simply. "People deserve good bread." And then he said good morning and he left, and Lucy stood in her bakery with flour on her hands and a warmth in her chest that felt like the first hour after a bread comes out of the oven, when everything smells perfect and right. She thought about him for the rest of that day. She thought about old Pete in his dugout with the bad leg. She thought about the McCready children and their grandmother. She thought about 12 miles of Texas road on a Tuesday morning, and a man who did not think it worth mentioning. The following Sunday, Lucy Archer did something she had never done before. She woke before even her usual early hour, in the blue dark before dawn, and she baked extra. She baked 12 loaves total, a full day's work of dough she had started the night before, and she set aside 4 of them before the bakery opened. She wrapped them in her best cloth, the white cotton with the blue edging she usually saved for special orders. When the Sunday morning church service was letting out and people were drifting across the square, she found Clara Finch and asked her, with the precise and direct manner she used for all important questions, where exactly the McCready property lay and how to get to Pete's dugout past the creek. Clara looked at her with barely suppressed delight. "You go north out of town on the main road, then take the left fork past the Cottonwood Grove. McCready's place is about 4 miles. For Pete, you stay on the creek path another mile past that." Lucy thanked her, went back to the bakery, finished her morning sales, cleaned the ovens, and then on Monday afternoon, with the light going long and golden, she hitched her small horse, a gray mare named Agnes, to the simple wagon she used for deliveries, loaded the wrapped loaves, and drove north. She had never been north of town before. She had been too busy building her business to think much about the land beyond the edge of it. But the road was clear, and the afternoon was warm, and the prairie grass moved in long golden waves like something breathing, and Lucy found herself letting out a slow breath she had not known she was holding. She found the McCready place by the fence line and the sound of children, 4 of them ranging from about 6 to 14, chasing a hound around the yard. A woman appeared in the doorway of the small house, older, with a face that had been hardened and softened in turns by weather and grief. She was wiping her hands on an apron. "Mrs. McCready," Lucy said from the wagon. "That's me," the woman said carefully. The children had stopped and were watching. "I'm Lucy Archer. I run the bakery in Clover Creek." She reached behind her and lifted the wrapped loaves. "I brought you some bread." The old woman's expression shifted through several things very quickly, something complex and proud struggling against something genuinely moved. "We didn't ask for charity," she said. "I know," Lucy said. "Mr. Winslow did. He pays for it every Tuesday. This is a delivery I should have been making all along and didn't think to. The fault is mine." There was a pause. One of the children, a girl of about 9, crept forward to look at the wrapped cloth with wide eyes. The grandmother came down the porch steps. "You're the one who makes the sourdough," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The woman took the bread with hands that were careful and dignified. "Thank you, Miss Archer," she said quietly. "It's my pleasure," Lucy said, and meant it precisely. She found Pete's dugout, a low structure built into the creek bank with a door that barely cleared her head, and knocked. He was an elderly man, leathery and white-bearded, with a leg that had been badly set after a break and left him with a rolling, painful gait. He took the bread with the directness of a man too old to bother with pretense, said, "Much obliged," and asked if she wanted to sit and drink water from his tin cup before the drive back. She said yes, and sat on a stump outside his door, and they watched the creek go silver in the late afternoon light, and Pete told her about the drought of 1874, and the cattle prices and a Comanche raid he had witnessed 30 years ago on a ranch east of the Staked Plains, the kind of history that was still living in the bones of this land. Lucy listened carefully and asked questions that showed she was actually paying attention, and Pete seemed to appreciate this more than the bread. She drove home in the early dark with the wagon empty and her mind full. On Tuesday, David Winslow arrived at 7:20 in the morning to find 6 loaves waiting and also Lucy Archer standing behind her counter with a particular expression on her face. "I went north yesterday," she said before he could speak. He had the same stillness she was coming to recognize as his particular quality, not absence but presence, a man who filled a room through quietness rather than noise. "Did you?" he said. "The McCready children are very sweet. The youngest asked me if I put magic in the bread." Something genuine moved through his face. "What did you say?" "I said I put sourdough starter my mother grew in Ohio and good Texas water and a hot oven." She said that sounded like magic. He set his money on the counter. I also met Pete, Lucy said. How is he? Stubborn and interesting, she said. We talked about the drought of 1874. He knows more history than any book, David said. She looked at him with that direct, undecorated attention of hers. Why didn't you just tell me the first day? You could have explained what the bread was for. You could have saved yourself months of riding in and laying money on a counter without a word. He considered this with the honesty she was beginning to expect from him. I didn't want you to think I was asking for credit or sympathy, he said, or asking you to lower your price. You set fair prices. I respected that. I see, she said. Then, I'm going to start setting aside an extra 4 loaves every Tuesday for the McCready family. You don't have to pay for those. He shook his head immediately, gently but firmly. I'll pay for everything I take, Miss Archer. I wouldn't want it any other way. She looked at him for a moment, long enough that a lesser person might have shifted. He did not. All right, she said. He picked up his loaves. He started to go. Mr. Winslow, she said. He turned again. She was aware in that moment of how naturally she said it, the simple habit of calling him back, as though the conversation between them was always in the middle of something rather than at the end. There's a community supper at the church on Saturday, she said. I'll be providing the bread, if you happen to be in town. A pause. What time does it start? He asked. 6 o'clock, she said. He nodded once, and there was something in the small formality of it that was more eloquent than a great deal of talking. He left. Lucy went back to her oven and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the warm iron surface, grounding herself. Then she got back to work because she was a woman who believed in work, and also because the morning's doughs needed turning. Saturday came in warm and clear. Lucy spent the day baking, filling the church hall's long tables with 17 loaves of various kinds: sourdough, cornbread, rye, the honey wheat. She wore her good blue dress, the one with the small white collar, and she had let her hair down from the braid and pinned it up properly, which took effort and felt, when she caught her reflection in the window glass, like the right decision. The supper was well attended. Most of Clover Creek came through the church hall doors at some point in the evening, along with a scattering of ranch folk from the surrounding territory. There was a roasted beef provided by the Henderson family, beans and corn and late winter squash, and a fiddle played by a young man named Tommy Reese, whose enthusiasm exceeded his precision, but who more than made up for this with energy. Lucy was behind the bread table, slicing and serving, when she saw David Winslow come through the door. He had cleaned up. The battered hat was the same, but the coat was a better one, dark and brushed, and he had shaved, which changed the structure of his face in a way she had not anticipated, softening the jaw slightly and making the gray of his eyes more visible. He was accompanied, she noticed, by the Salazar brothers, 2 young men in their early 20s with good manners and wide smiles who immediately found the beans and began doing them justice. He saw her across the room. He came over in that unhurried way of his, and she handed him a thick slice of sourdough without asking. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. She thought this was an important thing about him, that he did not say things he did not mean. "Did you drive in?" she asked. "Rode in, left the buckskin at the livery." "You can sit and eat," she said. "You don't have to stand at the bread table on my account." "I like the bread table," he said. She laughed, which surprised her slightly, the ease of it. It was not a performance of a laugh. It was just a real one, quick and genuine. He stayed at the bread table for a while, and then they drifted together toward the end of the hall when the music started, and they sat on the long bench against the wall and talked. She asked him about the ranch, the old Hargrove property, and he told her it had been badly neglected, the fences rotted, the main house with a collapsed section of roof and a well that needed redigging. He had spent the first year just making it livable. "Why that property specifically?" she asked. He thought about it. Because it had good water under it and the right kind of soil, and nobody else wanted it at the price it was selling for. And because it looked like something that had been given up on, and I've always had trouble walking away from things that haven't been given a fair chance. She looked at him. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was watching the dancers, Tommy Reese sawing through a reel, a handful of couples turning in the lamplight, but she had the feeling the words meant more than just land. "How long have you been in Clover Creek?" she asked. 2 years. You've been here 6 months. You know that precisely, she observed. I noticed when the bread sign went up, he said. He turned to look at her then, and his honesty was entirely uncomplicated, not a gambit, just the truth. I noticed the sign and I thought someone came here and built something, and I came in the following Tuesday. You waited 2 weeks, she said. I wanted to make sure you were staying, he said. Some people try the West and find it harder than they planned. Did I seem like someone who would leave? She asked. He almost smiled. No, you seemed like someone who came knowing exactly what the West was. The fiddle swung into a slower tune, and the dancing gentled to match it. They sat together in comfortable quiet for a moment, watching Hector pull from the general store, turning in a sedate circle with his wife, both of them looking satisfied in the particular way of people who have been happy together for a long time and have stopped needing to show it to anyone. "Do you want to dance?" David asked. She looked at him. "Can you dance?" "Adequately," he said, which she appreciated for being neither falsely modest nor boastful. She stood and he stood, and they walked to the open floor. He took her hand with a careful correctness, the other hand at the small of her back with a respectful distance she nonetheless felt all the way up her spine. They moved into the slow tune, and he danced adequately in exactly the way he had said, not flashy, not stumbling, just steady and present and easy to follow. "You're not from Texas originally," she said, because she could hear it slightly in his voice. "Missouri," he said. "Left when I was 19, came west with a cattle drive and didn't go back. Did you have family there?" "A mother and 2 sisters," he said. "They're still in St. Joseph. I write to them." She liked that he wrote to them. The detail was small and definitive. "Why didn't you go back?" she asked. He thought about the answer with his characteristic deliberateness. "Because out here a person can be what they make themselves," he said. "Back east, back in Missouri, there were all sorts of ideas already formed about who you were based on your family and your street and your church. Out here nobody cares about any of that. They care whether you work hard and keep your word and are straight with people." "Is that why you give away bread to your neighbors?" she asked. "Keeping your word to the idea of who you want to be." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in him that was not the composed steadiness she had catalogued so far, something that was more naked and unguarded. "My father wasn't a generous man," he said quietly. "I decided a long time ago that I'd be something different." She held his gaze because she was a woman who did not look away from important things. "I think you succeeded," she said. The music ended. They stepped apart with a small, formal courtesy that felt like its own kind of language. They walked back to the bench, and Lucy poured them both cups of the lemon water Clara Finch had made, and they drank and talked for another hour, through the noise and warmth of the room, until people began drifting home, and the candles burned lower, and Tommy Reese finally put down his bow. He walked her back to the bakery at the end of the evening, the town quiet and starlit and enormous around them, the Milky Way so thick above the flat land that it looked almost unreal, a thing too beautiful to be true. At the bakery door she turned to him. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "Miss Archer," he said. "Next Tuesday," she said. "I'll have 8 loaves ready." He smiled. Not the ghost of one this time, but the real thing, and it changed his face so completely that she felt the impact of it directly and physically, and made a mental note to prepare herself better in future. "I'll be here," he said. He tipped his hat, walked back down the dark street toward the livery, and Lucy went inside her bakery, stood in the dark smelling of bread and warmth, and pressed both hands flat against her cheeks because they were warm and she needed to cool them down before she went asleep. The weeks that followed were the best kind of slow. There is a particular pleasure in knowing something good is coming toward you and being in no rush to force it, in letting it develop at its own pace the way good bread does, not hurrying the rise but trusting the process. Lucy had spent enough time at her ovens to know that patience produced better things than urgency. David came every Tuesday, and now he stayed longer. At first he would stop and talk for 15 minutes while she finished her morning work, and then the 15 minutes became 30, and then he started arriving at 7 and staying until 9, sitting on the stool she had behind the counter and talking to her while she worked. She found that she did her best baking in those Tuesday mornings. There was something about his presence, the easy and undemanding quality of it, that settled her. He told her about the ranch in more detail, the east pasture that had the best grass, the problem with the creek flooding the low field every spring, the pair of horses he was hoping to breed, the kitchen garden he had tried to start and mostly failed at because he admitted without self-pity, not a gardener. She told him about Ohio, about her father's general store and the way the town there had smelled in winter, coal smoke and pine. About her mother's illness and the years of nursing her through it and watching the woman who had taught her to bake diminish slowly until she was gone. About coming west with the cast-iron stove and the recipe book and the specific, clarifying grief of being entirely on her own. "Weren't you frightened?" he asked, on a morning in June when the light was coming golden through her open door. "Terrified," she said. She was shaping a loaf with practiced hands, the motion smooth and meditative. "But my mother always said fear is just excitement that hasn't decided what it is yet, so I decided it was excitement." He watched her hands on the dough. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Lucy said. "She would have liked you." She did not look up when she said it, but she heard the quality of the silence that followed, and that told her enough. In July he asked if he could take her riding. He said he wanted to show her the property if she had interest. She said she had plenty of interest, and could he come on a Sunday when the bakery was closed, and he said yes. He came Sunday morning with the buckskin and a second horse, a bay mare he had borrowed from the Salazar brothers, a gentle animal with intelligent eyes. Lucy had ridden before. She was not a frontier novice, but she had not ridden for pleasure in some time, and there was a loosening of something in her as they moved out of town and into the open land. They rode north for an hour, and the land opened around them in the way it does in Texas, becoming increasingly itself. The grass is tall and moving, the sky immeasurable, the occasional mesquite standing solitary and determined against the horizon. She saw a hawk circle so high it was nearly invisible, and then fold and drop with a speed that made her catch her breath. The Hargrove Ranch, which David had named simply the Winslow place and had not yet gotten around to doing anything more official about, was larger than she had imagined. The main house was a low, long structure of sandstone and wood that had been badly battered but had good bones. He had fixed the roof and replastered the main room and built new shelving in the kitchen. The barn was solid. The fences along the west pasture were new wood, pale against the old. He showed her around with the unhurried pride of a man who had worked hard for something and knew its value without needing to boast about it. He showed her the well, redug and clean. He showed her the east pasture and the grass so thick and green it looked implausible in that dry country. "The creek runs year-round," he said. "Underground spring feeds it, that's what makes the pasture." She looked at the property with her practical eye and saw what he saw, something that had been abandoned and was being brought back, something with a future in it. "Your kitchen garden," she said. "What were you trying to grow?" He looked slightly rueful. "Tomatoes, some squash, beans." She looked at the patch of ground beside the south wall of the house, south-facing and sheltered, which was exactly right for a kitchen garden. "The problem," she said, going over and crouching to look at the soil, "is that you need to work more organic material into this. It's too sandy. Coffee grounds if you can get them from the saloon, and you need to layer some of that creek grass. And you're planting too early in the season. Wait until the night temperatures are consistent." He crouched beside her and looked at the soil. Their shoulders were nearly touching. She was acutely aware of this. She kept her eyes on the ground. "You know gardening," he said. "My mother did," she said. "I watched." "If I did what you said," he said, "and the tomatoes came up, I'd bring you some." She looked at him then, and they were close enough that she could see the particular texture of the gray of his eyes, the way they had those faint undertones of green near water. "I'd like that," she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment that had the quality of something important, something being said without words, the kind of conversation that happens before the words are ready. Then he stood and offered her his hand to help her up, and she took it, and when she was standing they were very close together, and the afternoon was warm and still and golden, and he did not immediately let go of her hand. "Miss Archer," he said very quietly. "Lucy," she said. "You can call me Lucy." He exhaled, something that was almost a sigh but was better than that, something that sounded like relief. "Lucy," he said. "David," she said. And then they were simply standing in the south-facing garden patch beside his house in the afternoon light, holding hands, and it was the most natural and most momentous thing she had experienced in several years. They rode back to Clover Creek in the long evening light, and the conversation between them had a new quality to it, easier and warmer, the first names doing what first names always do, which is to take down a particular kind of wall while leaving all the important things intact. At the edge of town, he said he would ride in with her to make sure she got back safely, and she said she had been getting back safely on her own for 6 months and was quite competent, and he said he knew that and wanted to come anyway, and she said all right. He left her at the bakery door and rode back out of town, and she went inside and stood in the good dark and let herself feel the size of what was happening, which was quite considerable, and then she banked her fire for the morning and went to bed. August was hot and golden and full. She made extra loaves every Tuesday, and he bought everyone and stayed 2 hours, and they talked about everything that came naturally, books and land, and the weather and whether Texas would ever cool down in summer, and what her mother's recipe book said about keeping sourdough starter alive in the heat. He came Sunday again, and they rode east this time, past the cottonwood grove where the creek bent, and the shade was deep and cool, and they sat on the bank and watched the water, and she thought that she had never been so comfortable with a person in all her life. She began to understand something about him. He was a man who had been alone for a long time, not unhappily but honestly, a man who had arranged his life around work and integrity and the care of people he had chosen to care for, and who had not rushed toward anything or anyone because he took seriously the things he committed to. She recognized this quality because she had it too. She also understood, and this was perhaps more important, that he was afraid of doing this wrong, of saying something too much or too little, of frightening her or presuming. She could see it in the carefulness of him, the particular restraint of a man who was not cold but measured, who chose his moments the way he chose his words. So it was Lucy who, on a Tuesday morning in late August, when the bakery was warm and fragrant and the town was still waking up and they were alone in the good quiet of early morning, said the thing that needed saying. She had just handed him the first wrapped loaf, and their hands were both on it for a moment, her passing and him receiving, and she looked at him directly and said, "David, I think you should know that I am very happy when you are here." He was absolutely still. Then he set the loaf down on the counter carefully, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and careful honesty that her heart did something large and unscheduled. "I think about you every day of the week," he said. "Between Tuesdays, I think about what you're doing and whether the heat is hard on your ovens and whether your sourdough starter is well, which I recognize is an unusual thing to think about." "It is slightly unusual," she said, but she was smiling. "I'm not a man who says things I don't mean," he said. "So I want to be clear that what I'm about to say I mean entirely." He paused. "I would like to court you properly, Lucy, if you're willing. I'd like to come on Sundays and ride with you and sit with you and learn everything about you that there is to know. And I'd like to do it in the right way, in the open, where everyone can see." She looked at him for a long moment, at this careful, honest, grave man with his dusty hat and his sourdough and his 12 miles of Tuesday road. "Yes," she said. He smiled. "The real one, the one that changed everything." "Also," she said, picking up the next wrapped loaf and handing it to him with deliberate calm, because she was, at the end of the day, a woman who ran a business and had things to do, "the McCready children asked about you. The oldest one, the girl, wants to know if you can teach her to ride." He blinked. She wants to learn. She's 14 and determined, Lucy said. I told her I'd mention it. I'll speak to her grandmother, he said, and his voice had that note in it of a man making a practical decision that was also a moral one, so naturally and simply that it could barely even be called a decision. She watched him leave with the loaves, and then she turned back to her ovens, and she allowed herself, privately, a moment of the fullest happiness she had felt in several years. Then she shaped the next batch of dough and got on with the morning. Autumn arrived in the way it does in Texas, not the sharp drama of eastern falls but a gentler softening of the light, a lowering of the punishing heat, an almost imperceptible shift in the angle of the sun that made the prairie grass go from gold to bronze. The days were perfect, and Lucy took full advantage of them. David came on Sundays without fail. They rode and they walked and they sat on the creek bank and they attended the church suppers and the town meetings and the autumn dance that Hector Poole organized in the square, with lanterns strung between the buildings and Tommy Reese on his fiddle again, and this time a second musician, a man with a banjo who was better. They danced 3 times, which in a small town in 1878 was a statement that everyone understood and nobody needed explained. She gave him a jar of her sourdough starter. She wrapped it carefully and gave it to him on a Sunday with instructions for keeping it alive, written out in her clean handwriting. He took it with the seriousness it deserved and reported back the following Tuesday that it had survived the 12-mile ride without incident and was being kept in a cool corner of his kitchen. He brought her tomatoes in September, 6 of them, from the garden that had come up against all odds in the south-facing patch beside his house, small and round and brilliantly red. He presented them wrapped in a cloth with no ceremony whatsoever, but his eyes were doing something that was entirely ceremonious. She made bread with tomatoes that week, a recipe she invented on the spot, and it was excellent, and she told him so when he came on Tuesday. Good soil, good sun, and a little patience, he said. You're talking about the tomatoes, she said. I am, he said, and his eyes were entirely steady. She kissed him for the first time on a Sunday in October. They were standing at the edge of his east pasture in the afternoon light, looking out over the green grass and the far line of the horizon, and she turned to him, and he turned to her, and she rose onto her toes and kissed him cleanly and with intention. He was very still for exactly 1 second, and then his hand came up to her face with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and he kissed her back in a way that was thorough and gentle and entirely unequivocal. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and there was the particular silence of 2 people who have arrived at something they knew was coming, and find it is even better than they anticipated. Well, she said. Well, he said, and his voice was slightly different, warmer and softer, a quality she filed away carefully. They rode back in the late October afternoon, side by side, talking easily about nothing of consequence, and Lucy thought that this might be the particular shape that love takes when it comes to serious people. Not an explosion but an arrival. Not a lightning strike but a fire that has been burning steadily and only now been allowed to show its full light. November brought cold, and with it some news that was neither good nor bad but complicated. Lucy's landlord, a man named Grant Tully who owned half the commercial properties in Clover Creek, came into the bakery on a Wednesday morning and told her that he intended to raise her rent in January by 30% because the town was growing and property values were going up. She received this information with the same stillness she gave all information before deciding what to do about it. She thanked him, said she would consider it, and returned to her dough. That Tuesday she told David about it. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "That's steep." "It is," she said. "Can the business carry it?" She had been running the numbers. "Yes, but it would mean increasing my prices or reducing what I set aside for equipment replacement. I've been saving to eventually get a larger oven." "Could you find a different property?" he asked. "Maybe," she said, "but this location is good. The foot traffic works for me." He thought about it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She noticed that he asked what she wanted to do, not what he thought she should do, not what he was going to help her do. He asked what she wanted. "I want to keep the location," she said, "and I want to negotiate Tully down to 15%. Can you do that?" "I've never tried negotiating with him, but I'm not frightened of the conversation," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you are." She negotiated Tully down to 15% the following week. She went in with numbers and spoke plainly about the value she added to the area, the foot traffic she brought to the whole block, the fact that she maintained the property in better condition than any previous tenant. Tully was a practical man and recognized a well-made argument. He agreed to 15%. She told David on Tuesday. He looked pleased in the quiet way he was pleased by things, a kind of internal satisfaction that showed in his eyes more than anywhere else. "Of course you did," he said. "You weren't worried," she observed. "Not for a single moment," he said. December was cold and bright, and the bakery was busier than ever because people were cooking holiday meals and needed bread in quantities that kept Lucy at her ovens from before dawn until mid-afternoon. She added a seasonal sweet bread, flavored with molasses and dried fruit, that sold out in 2 hours every morning she made it. She ordered the dried fruit from Hector's store in advance and thanked him for stocking it, and he told her it was a pleasure, and that his wife had declared Lucy's sweet bread the best thing to arrive in Clover Creek in 10 years. David spent Christmas Eve in town. He came to the church service on Christmas morning, which he had not done before, and stood beside Lucy in the pew and sang the carols in a voice that was not remarkable but was sincere, and she stood close to him in the cold church with the pine boughs on the windowsills and thought she was in the exact right place. After the service he gave her a gift. It was a book, a well-made one with a leather cover, the collected works of George Eliot. It was not a frivolous gift or a decorative one. It was the gift of a man who had listened carefully and learned that she liked to read in the evenings when her work was done, and had never been able to bring many books west with her. She gave him a new hat. She had ordered it from the catalog, and it had come in November, and she had kept it in the back of the bakery, wrapped, for 3 weeks. It was a proper wide-brimmed hat in good felt, the kind that would keep both sun and rain off a man who spent most of his days outdoors. She had examined the old hat he always wore with its battered crown and decided the time had come. He put it on immediately, and it suited him considerably, and she told him so, and his ears went the slightest bit red in a way that she found deeply endearing. They stood outside the church in the cold, bright December morning, and the Salazar brothers rode by and called out Christmas greetings, and the Macready grandmother came with her 4 grandchildren, and the eldest, the 14-year-old girl named Ellen, had clearly been having riding lessons because she had a new confidence in the way she stood, some straightening in the spine. She looked at David with the frank gratitude of a young person who will not quite say thank you aloud because the feeling is too large for words. David gave Ellen a small leather pouch. Inside it were 3 books on horsemanship he had ordered from a supplier in St. Louis. Lucy watched Ellen open it and watched David's face while she did, the particular expression of a man who is genuinely glad to have given something useful. She reached over without thinking and took his hand. He laced his fingers through hers, and they stood in the cold Christmas morning and watched Clover Creek go about its December business, and it was good. January of 1879 arrived with a hard freeze that coated everything in a thin glitter of ice and made the roads treacherous. Lucy kept her ovens burning high to compensate for the cold that crept under the bakery door, and she sold twice the usual bread because warm bread in a hard freeze is one of life's most fundamental comforts. She made soup too, a big pot of it every other day, selling it by the bowl from the counter alongside the bread, and this was not strictly a bakery's business, but it seemed the right thing to do, and the town responded warmly. David drove into town on Tuesday in the freezing cold in a wagon rather than on horseback because the road was too icy for safe riding, and she saw him from the window and had a cup of hot coffee waiting when he came through the door. He looked at the coffee and then at her. "Sit," she said. "Drink it before you take the bread out in that cold." He sat at the small table she had in the corner and drank the coffee, and she sat across from him for a few minutes because the morning was quiet and she could, and they talked about the freeze and the cattle and whether the McCready family had enough fuel for the winter. He had ridden out there the week before with a wagon load of firewood. "Of course you had," she said. He looked at her over the coffee cup. "You say that like it's predictable," he said. "It is," she said warmly. "You are reliably and entirely yourself. I find it the most attractive quality a person can have." He set the cup down. He looked at her across the small table in the winter quiet of her bakery, with the fire in the oven and the smell of bread and the cold light coming through the frost-edged windows. "Lucy," he said. "Yes," she said, though he hadn't asked anything yet. A pause, a smile, the real one. "I haven't asked anything yet." "I know," she said. "But yes, whatever it is." He shook his head slightly, but he was smiling, and the smile was doing the thing it always did to her equilibrium. He reached into the inside pocket of his heavy coat and produced a small object, a ring made of silver, plain and well-made, with a small piece of turquoise set simply in the center, blue-green as a sky after rain. He held it on his palm across the table. He did not kneel. He did not make a production of it. He simply held it and looked at her with the complete and honest directness she had come to rely on like a fixed point. "I know what I'm asking is not a simple thing," he said. "Your business is here and it matters and it's yours, and I would never want to change that. I've thought about this carefully. My ranch is 12 miles from your bakery. That's a long ride every day, and I wouldn't ask you to do it. But the land office is selling a lot on the north end of Main Street. It's big enough to build on, big enough for a house with a good kitchen. We could have both things, the ranch and the town. I could come in during the week. We could build something that holds what you've built and what I'm building and makes them fit together." She looked at the ring on his palm. She looked at his face. She thought of 12 miles of Tuesday Road. She thought of sourdough starter surviving a bumpy ride. She thought of tomatoes in a south-facing garden and a 14-year-old girl learning to ride and firewood in a hard freeze and an old man in a dugout and a grandmother's careful dignity and a first dance that was adequate in exactly the right way. She reached out and picked up the ring. "There is," she said, "one condition." He waited. "You keep coming on Tuesday mornings," she said. "Even after we're married. I like having you in the bakery." He exhaled, and it was the most eloquent sound she had ever heard. "Every Tuesday for the rest of my life," he said. She put the ring on her finger. It fit. They were married in March of 1879, exactly 1 year after the first Tuesday he had walked through her door in the little church with the crooked steeple. The ceremony was performed by the pastor, a kind and sensible man named Reverend Ashby, who did not add unnecessary flourishes to the vows and got right to the heart of what the occasion meant. Lucy wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months, ivory wool with careful embroidery at the cuffs, her hair properly arranged with the help of Clara Finch, who turned out to be skilled at such things, and who wept a small, satisfied tear at the end of the ceremony. David wore his new hat and his best coat and a clean white shirt that she suspected was new, and which he would deny being new if asked. And he stood at the front of that small, crooked-steepled church and watched her walk in with the expression of a man who is seeing the thing he has been working toward and finds it is real. They said the vows in clear, even voices, and he put a second ring beside the turquoise one, plain gold, and she put a plain gold band on his hand, and it looked right there, the way things look right when they are in their proper place. The Salazar brothers attended and ate a great deal at the reception afterward. Old Pete came, having borrowed a mule from the McCready family to make the trip, and he sat in the corner of the church hall with a glass of cider and watched the dancing with the satisfied expression of someone who has lived long enough to know what is worth celebrating. Ellen McCready, who had been riding for 4 months by then and had developed a proper seat, came with her younger siblings and her grandmother, and the grandmother brought a dish of sweet corn pudding and refused to arrive empty-handed, which Lucy had known she would not. They danced. They ate. The loaves of bread Lucy had baked the morning of her own wedding, because she had insisted on doing it herself and had started before 4 in the morning, were on the long tables, and they were the best she had ever made. She did not know if this was because she had taken particular care or because she was happy, but she suspected both things were true and that they were related. That spring they bought the north lot and hired Chester the blacksmith's nephew, a young man named Will who had carpentry skills and a willingness to work, to build the house. David came in during the week to supervise and to help with the heavier work, and by summer's end the house was standing. A good solid building with wide windows and a large kitchen with a stone hearth big enough for a serious oven, which was the detail Lucy had specified first when they drew up the plans. She kept the bakery. She walked to it every morning before dawn, and she came home every afternoon, and the 12 miles to the ranch David managed during the week, riding out on Monday and Friday and some Wednesdays to see to the cattle and the fences and the horses. The Salazar brothers were full-time hands now and lived in the bunkhouse David had built, and the ranch was beginning to produce in earnest, the east pasture cattle fat and glossy, the herd growing steadily. Ellen McCready, now 15, had begun riding out to the ranch on Saturdays to continue her lessons and to help with the horses in exchange, which suited everyone. She had a gift for horses that David recognized and encouraged methodically. In the autumn of 1879, Lucy discovered she was going to have a child. She told David on a Tuesday morning in the bakery, simply and directly, the way she told him everything. She was wrapping loaves and he was sitting on his stool, and she looked up from the twine and said, "I'm expecting." He went entirely still in that particular way of his, and she watched the stillness give way to something that moved through his face slowly, starting with comprehension and moving through astonishment and settling into something so purely glad that she felt the impact of it in her chest. He came around the counter. He held her face in both hands, large, careful hands that smelled of horse and leather and the open land, and he kissed her forehead. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "I'm excellent," she said. "Slightly nauseous in the mornings, but I'm told that passes." "Does it?" he said, and his voice had that warmth in it, the warm and quiet register she had come to know as his truest one. "So I've been told," she said. "We should tell Clara Finch," he said, which made Lucy laugh, because Clara had been anticipating this news with such enthusiasm for the last 6 months that she would likely explode if not informed immediately. Their son was born in the spring of 1880. They named him Thomas, for David's grandfather, a man David spoke of with particular respect, a Missouri farmer who had been fair and steady, and who David clearly carried within himself as a kind of internal compass. Thomas arrived in April with a lusty voice and dark hair, and an expression of great seriousness that made the midwife laugh. David held his son with the same careful deliberateness he held everything important, and looked at Lucy with an expression so complete and full that she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into her palm. The McCready grandmother came to see the baby and said he was healthy and good-looking, and that the Winslow family had done well for itself, which was the highest form of praise she offered. Pete made the mule journey again, this time bringing a carved wooden rattle he had made himself over the winter months, and told Thomas very seriously that he had a good sound set of lungs and should consider a career in oratory. Lucy was back at the bakery within 6 weeks, with Thomas in a wooden cradle behind the counter, and the women of Clover Creek who came in the mornings divided their attention between the bread and the baby in a way that was very efficient from Lucy's perspective. David came every Tuesday, without exception. He sat on his stool and talked to her while she worked and held Thomas when the baby was fretful, which he managed with a natural ease that never failed to strike her, the ease of a big quiet man with a small warm person in his arms. The ranch grew. The herd doubled. David hired 2 more hands in the summer of 1881 and began talking about a second water trough and whether to expand into sheep alongside the cattle, a conversation that he brought to Lucy because he brought everything important to Lucy. And she looked at the numbers with him, and they talked it through over the kitchen table after Thomas was asleep, the lamp between them, the Texas night enormous outside the wide windows. She suggested sheep and he agreed, and they added a small flock and discovered that wool sold well in the autumn market. She expanded the bakery, added a second oven, the large stone one she had been saving for, and hired a girl named Rosa, just 17, the younger sister of one of the Salazar brothers, who had a quick mind and good hands and who Lucy trained with the same methodical care her own mother had used. Rosa turned out to have a particular talent for the sweet breads, the molasses loaves and the cornbread, and the two of them fell into an easy working rhythm that made the mornings run faster and let Lucy take a Sunday off occasionally without the bakery suffering. In the autumn of 1882, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara, which produced in Clara Finch a reaction of such emotional magnitude that Hector Poole was moved to bring out his handkerchief. Clara was dark-eyed and alert from the beginning, watching everything with the comprehensive attention of someone who intends to understand what is happening. David declared, at 3 months, that she had her mother's way of looking at a person, which Lucy took as a compliment even though it was stated with the affectionate wariness of a man who knew exactly what that gaze meant. Thomas was 2.5 and regarded his sister with the guarded interest of a person who has not yet decided whether this development is good or bad, but was leaning toward good because she produced a great deal of entertaining noise and seemed interested in him specifically. The years settled into a richness that Lucy had not expected when she had driven her wagon west with the cast-iron stove and her mother's recipe book. She had expected independence and competence and a business that worked. She had not expected all of this other texture, the particular joy of a husband who was entirely himself with her, and with whom she was entirely herself, the weight and smell and personality of children, the way the town of Clover Creek had become not just a location, but a community of people whose lives were interwoven with hers in the way fabric is woven, each thread distinct and the whole stronger for it. She thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, in the hour before dawn when she was alone in the bakery stoking the fire and preparing the doughs, the hour that had always been hers and still was, the sacred quiet time before the world woke up. She thought about her mother and the recipe book and the sourdough starter that had come from Ohio and still lived in her kitchen, still made the bread she was shaping now, that continuity of living culture traveling west with her and making itself at home in new soil. She thought about the first Tuesday, the bell above the door and the tall man in the battered hat and the 2 silver dollars on her counter. She thought about counting those dollars twice with flour on her hands. In the spring of 1883, she found herself buying a small plot of land adjacent to the bakery, with the idea of eventually expanding to offer a small dining room, a place where people could sit and eat bread and soup and coffee. She drew up the plans herself on a sheet of brown paper and showed them to David on a Tuesday morning. He studied them for a long time in the way he studied things that mattered, and then he said, "The kitchen needs to be bigger. If you're going to serve soup in winter, you'll need more oven space than this allows." "I was thinking that too," she said. He put his finger on the paper. "Move the wall here." She looked at where he was pointing. "That works," she said. Smiled. She had never stopped feeling the particular impact of that smile, the way it changed the whole landscape of his face. She suspected she never would. "You want to build something," he said. "I always want to build something," she said. He looked at her across the plans and the counter and the flour and the bread and all the Tuesday mornings. "That's why I walked through your door the first day," he said. "I saw the sign and I thought, someone who wants to build something, and I wanted to meet her." She put both her hands flat on the counter between them, leaning forward slightly. "It took you 2 weeks after the sign went up," she reminded him. "I told you," he said. "I wanted to make sure you were staying." "I'm staying," she said. "I've been staying." "You have," he said, and his voice had that register of truest warmth. "You have been staying the whole time." She straightened and took the brown paper plans and rolled them under her arm. "I'll speak to Will about the construction this week," she said. "I'll come in Wednesday to help mark the measurements," he said. "You have fencing to do on Wednesday," she said. "I'll come in Wednesday," he said simply, and that was that. He took his loaves. He said good morning. He went out the door into the spring morning. The new wide-brimmed hat she had bought him 3 years ago and which he now wore as naturally as if it had grown there. She watched him through the window, the familiar shape of him, the unhurried walk to the buckskin, the way he tied the loaves into the saddlebags with practiced ease, and then stood for a moment looking at the sky before mounting, a habit she had noticed years ago and had asked him about once. He had said he always looked at the sky in the morning to get the weather and the light, to understand what the day was going to be. She had thought it was a very good habit to start the day by paying attention to it. She turned back to her ovens. She had 4 loaves coming up on the rise and 2 more ready to score. Rosa would be in at 7:30. Thomas needed breakfast at the house before she took him to Clara Finch's for the morning, because at 2:30 Clara was still too young for the bakery's busy hours, but Thomas at 4 had begun coming in occasionally, and sitting on the stool his father had claimed, and eating bread ends with gravity. She worked the morning steadily and well, and the bread came out perfect, and the day was warm and full, and Clover Creek woke up around her in its particular way, the smithy ringing and the dusty Rose opening its shutters and Hector Poole sweeping his front step, and the children of several families running past on errands or on no business at all, which is the most important kind of business children have. On Wednesday David came in to measure for the expansion. They stood together in the small adjacent lot with a length of rope and a stick and worked out the dimensions, and he held one end of the rope, and she held the other, and they paced it out in the morning light, adjusting and reconsidering, and it was entirely practical and also entirely the most pleasure she could imagine. They broke ground in May. The expansion was finished by late summer, a proper dining room with 6 tables and chairs that were built sturdy and straight, big windows looking onto the street, and the expanded kitchen with the extra oven space that David had said she needed, and that she was very glad to have. She put checked cloth on the tables and a bunch of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, and opened the dining room on a Monday morning in August of 1883. Every table was filled by 8 o'clock. She served bread and butter and soup, simple and good, and strong coffee that she had learned to make in the way Texas preferred it, which was strong enough to stand a spoon in. Rosa managed the bread while Lucy circulated between the kitchen and the tables, and by noon she had served 64 people and run out of soup, which was a problem she would solve before tomorrow. She solved it by making more soup. She solved most problems by doing more and thinking better. The dining room became, within a season, the social center of a certain part of Clover Creek's life. The morning coffee crowd, the midday diners, the occasional private dinners she arranged for the church's charity events. She hired a second girl, a young woman named Marguerite who was 19 and recently arrived from Louisiana with a Creole grandmother's cooking knowledge and a way with seasoning that Lucy immediately recognized as a genuine gift. The business grew. The family grew. The town grew. Clover Creek in 1884 had 600 people and a second doctor and a proper school in a building rather than a converted room, and Lucy was on the committee that decided what books the school library would stock, a role she took with characteristic seriousness. Ellen McCready, by that year, was 20 and had become, under David's patient teaching, an excellent horsewoman. She had taken a job at a ranch east of town, where she managed the quarter-horse breeding program, with a skill that the owner freely admitted exceeded his own expectations. She came by the bakery on Saturdays and ate bread and talked to Lucy with the ease of a young woman who has had a model of what female capability looks like and has taken it fully to heart. Old Pete died in the winter of 1883, quietly, in his dugout by the creek, with a blanket around him and a nearly finished loaf of Lucy's bread on his table. The man who found him said it looked like he had simply decided he was done and lay down. He was buried in the Clover Creek cemetery with a proper marker, because David arranged it and paid for it without being asked, and the Reverend Ashby said a good service. Lucy put a small wildflower bunch on Pete's grave every spring when the flowers came up. She thought he would have appreciated wildflowers more than anything cultivated. Spring of 1885 brought a fourth member to the Winslow household, a second boy they named James, who arrived with red hair that mystified both parents for a moment, and then Lucy remembered her grandmother's description of a gray tuncle in County Cork, and laughed with the particular delight of unexpected genetics. James was nothing like the serious Thomas or the watchful young Clara. He was noisy and cheerful and enthusiastic about everything, crawling at 7 months with a determination that left the household slightly alarmed, and David installing a small fence across the kitchen door as a precaution. Thomas, who was 5, regarded James with a patience that David said was entirely Lucy's trait, and that Lucy said was clearly from David. Clara, 3, was enchanted by the red hair, and liked to sit next to James's cradle and explain things to him in a running monologue that was largely incomprehensible, but delivered with great authority. David held James the way he had held Thomas and Clara, with both hands and full attention, and James responded to this by attempting to chew on David's hat, which David allowed because what was a hat for after all, if not to be of use? The bakery and dining room ran smoothly in these years, with Rosa and Marguerite handling more and more of the day-to-day as Lucy spent slightly more of her mornings in the house with the children before walking to work. She was still there by 6 most mornings, still had the first loaves in before 7, still opened the bread table before the dining room tables were set. She still loved the work. That had never changed. The smell of the ovens and the warm early mornings, and the particular satisfaction of shaping dough that was exactly right in her hands. The sourdough starter from Ohio, now 7 years into its Texas life, still vigorous, still particular, still making bread with a character she had never found in any other. She had taught Thomas to shape bread by the time he was 6. He was methodical about it in a way that reminded her of herself. Clara was more interested in the eating than the making, which was equally valid. She taught David, too, in the long evenings sometimes, when the children were in bed and the kitchen was warm and she was preparing the dough for the next morning's early bake. She taught him the feel of it, how the gluten develops under your hands and what properly worked dough feels like compared to underdeveloped, how to know by touch and smell when the starter is ready. He learned with the same focused attention he brought to learning anything, and his hands, those large, careful hands, turned out to be well suited to the work. On Tuesday mornings he still came, without exception. He still walked through her door at 7 and put his money on the counter and took the loaves she had ready, still drove or rode out to the Macready family, and to the neighbors and to whoever, in the changing constellation of the surrounding community, needed something that week. The Macready children were grown or growing, the family was more stable now. The oldest boy had a job at the livery, but there were always others, new families settling, older folks who had trouble getting to town, people going through a hard season. He never made a production of it. He never expected credit for it. It was simply the thing he did, the same way he fixed his fences and bred his horses and looked at the sky every morning. The way he was. One Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1886, Lucy was behind the counter when David walked in, and she looked up and felt, as she always felt when he walked through that door, the particular warmth of something settling into rightness, the way bread smells when it is done and perfect. 8 years since the first Tuesday. 8 loaves on the sill that first day she had asked him the question. She thought about the question now with a kind of private delight, the simple directness of it, the thing she had held behind her teeth for weeks, and finally said out loud, "How many people are you feeding?" "Just myself," he had said. "And then, I give most of it away." She watched him come to the counter and set down his money, exact and clean as always. She watched him look at the loaves she had ready, 12 of them this week, because she had made extra knowing he would be here. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "You made extra," he said. "I knew you were coming," she said. He looked at her, the steady gray eyes, the faint color in them she had learned to see as warmth, the set of the jaw that was her particular terrain, familiar in the way of something you have studied long enough to know its smallest variations. There was a bit of frost in his hair at the temples now, just beginning, that she found she was entirely in favor of. "There's a new family on the South Road," he said. "Just settled. They had a hard crossing, came from Kansas, 2 small children, the mother is exhausted. I thought I'd take them something." "I know," she said. "Marguerite mentioned her husband came in for soup yesterday. Take the sourdough and 2 of the cornbread." He picked up the designated loaves. He looked at her with the expression that was his most internal, the one that was not for anyone to see but her. "You were already thinking about them," he said. "I'm always thinking about them," she said. He came around the counter, which he had begun doing some years back, and kissed her. It was a Tuesday morning kitchen kiss, the kind you do not need to think about because it is simply the texture of the day, and it tasted of coffee. "I'll be home for supper," he said. "I made the bean soup last night," she said. "It's ready. Thomas wants to come ride on Saturday," he said. "Is that all right?" "He's been asking for 2 weeks," she said. "You have my permission to take him." "He's got good instincts," David said, with the quiet pride of a man who will not overstate. "Of course he does," Lucy said. "He's ours." He smiled, picked up the bread, went out the door. She watched him through the window, the familiar shape moving toward the buckskin, the loaves under his arm, the way he looked at the sky before mounting. She did not know exactly what he saw up there every morning. She thought it was probably exactly what he said, the weather, the light, the quality of the day. She also thought it might be something more than that, the habit of a man who had learned to pay attention, to not assume the day would be the same as the one before, to look at what was actually there rather than what he expected. She turned back to the ovens. The morning was fully underway. She could hear Rosa in the kitchen beginning the next batch, the familiar sound of the dough being worked, the rhythm of it. She could hear the first customers of the day on the street outside, the town waking into its particular Tuesday self. She shaped the next loaf in her hands, feeling the dough as she always had, warm and alive and full of the particular chemistry that turned simple ingredients, flour and water and salt and thyme, into something that nourished. The starter her mother had begun in Ohio, that had come west with her across the wide country, that had made bread in Kansas City and in the wagon camp outside Clover Creek and in this stone oven all these years, was still going, still particular, still turning out something she was proud of. She thought it was not unlike marriage. She thought it was not unlike any living thing you tended. You fed it, you kept it at the right temperature, you were patient with it, and it kept giving back to you, kept making something warm and real out of what you put in. The giving and the getting so intertwined you could not always say where one ended and the other began. Supper that evening was around the table in the house on the north end of Main Street, the house David had proposed before he proposed, the house built around a large kitchen with wide windows. Thomas and Clara and James at the table with a quantity of noise that had long ago become the most comfortable sound Lucy knew. David across from her, talking to Thomas about Saturday's ride with the patient attentiveness he gave to conversations that mattered. The lamp warm between them. The bean soup she had made, good and thick in the bowl. Her bread in the center of the table, the Tuesday bread. They said grace the way they always did, simply, David's voice low and even. And then the noise resumed and the soup was eaten, and Clara informed James with great authority that he was holding his spoon the wrong way, and James said he was not, and Thomas said nothing because he was already thinking about horses. After the children were in bed, David and Lucy sat in the kitchen in the quiet, the way they often did, with the lamp and the cooling stove and the comfortable silence that had been building for years and was by now so rich and full it needed no filling. She had her mother's recipe book open on the table, not reading it exactly, just having it there the way some people have a lamp even when they don't need the light. He had the ledger he kept for the ranch accounts, making notes in the careful handwriting he had developed over years of keeping track of his own things. "David," she said. He looked up. "I'm happy," she said, not as a report, not as a declaration requiring response, just as a true thing offered simply. He looked at her for a moment with the full quality of his attention, the kind that had nothing else in it. "So am I," he said. And that was the whole of it, said plainly and meant entirely, the way they had always said things to each other, without embellishment or performance, without the need to dress up something that was already, in itself, exactly right. The starter for the next morning's bread was already working in its crock on the shelf. The children were asleep. The 12-mile road north ran through the starlit Texas dark toward the east pasture and the creek and the good spring water and the south-facing garden that still grew tomatoes every summer, small and red and real. In the morning she would rise before the sun. She would stoke the fire. She would shape the dough. She would open the bakery door and ring the bell into the Clover Creek morning. And the day would begin as it always began, with flour and warmth and the smell of bread, and the particular steadiness of a life that had been built carefully and kept faithfully, one Tuesday at a time.